Members of the jury, before you is a case that may seem unusual, but nonetheless requires your serious consideration. The defendant is charged with trespassing, a charge that stems from an incident involving an unauthorized parachute landing. The facts of the case are as follows. The defendant, an experienced parachutist, is accused of deliberately landing on private property without permission from the owner. This act of trespassing is not merely a question of an errant landing. It is alleged that the defendant planned this descent as a form of protest. The prosecution has presented evidence indicating that the defendant chose the location as a symbolic gesture, aiming to draw attention to a cause they deemed worthy. However, regardless of the intent, the law is clear. One cannot invade another's property without consent. The defense has argued that the defendant's actions were harmless and that the landing caused no damage or disruption. They maintain that the defendant's intentions were pure and that the act should be seen as a form of free expression rather than a criminal offense. As jurors, your task isn't to judge the worthiness of the defendant's cause or the sincerity of their beliefs. Your duty is to determine whether the defendant knowingly and intentionally trespassed on private property in violation of the law. In your deliberations, you must consider the following questions. Did the defendant knowingly enter onto the property without permission? Was the act of trespassing intentional and premeditated? Has the prosecution provided sufficient evidence to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant committed the act of trespassing? The concept of beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard by which you must judge the evidence in this case. This is the highest standard of proof that must be met in a criminal trial. If you find that the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt, then you must return a verdict of guilty. If, however, you find that the prosecution has not met this burden, or if there is a reasonable doubt as to the defendant's guilt, then you must return a verdict of not guilty. The right to property is a fundamental principle upon which our society is built. It ensures that individuals can enjoy the fruits of their labor without fear of unwarranted malice. At the same time, we must balance this right with the freedoms that are the hallmark of our democracy, including the freedom of liberty. The defendant's actions have brought these principles into conflict. It is for you to decide where the line between expression and infringement lies, and whether the defendant crossed that line. As you consider the evidence, remember that the defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof lies with the prosecution, and the defendant is under no obligation to prove their innocence. Your verdict will have implications, not only for the defendant, but also for the sanctity of private property and the limits of free expression. It is a weighty responsibility, but one that I am confident you will handle with the utmost care and consideration. In considering this case, you must also ponder the nature of the property trespassed upon. The land in question is not merely a plot of earth. It is a space imbued with the personal significance and privacy of the owner. When the defendant descended from the sky, they did not simply land on the ground. They intruded upon a sanctuary deemed private by the laws that govern us. The prosecution has argued that the defendant's actions, regardless of their purported symbolism, amounted to an invasion of this sanctuary. They have presented evidence that the defendant had alternative means to express their views without violating the sanctity of private property. The law does not excuse trespassing on the basis of the trespasser's intentions, however noble they may be perceived. The defense, however, has invited you to consider the context of the act. They have highlighted the defendant's history of activism and the lack of harm caused by the landing. They ask you to weigh the value of the message against the letter of the law. As jurors, you are the arbiters of this balance. You must decide whether the defendant's right to free speech justifies the breach of another's right to property. It is a delicate equilibrium, one that lies at the core of our freedoms. Furthermore, you must consider the potential precedent your verdict will set. A decision in favor of the defendant could embolden others to disregard property rights under the guise of protest. A decision against the defendant could be seen as a limitation on the freedom of expression. With these instructions, I now entrust this case to you. Discuss this with diligence and let your conscience and the law be your guide.